Let's get to our panel. Jonathan Broder is with us here in Washington. He's covered the Middle East as a foreign correspondent and is currently a contributing editor for Newsweek magazine. Joining us from Minneapolis, Minnesota is Matthew RJ Brodsky. He's a senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy and the Security Studies Group. Graeme Bannerman is the founder of Bannerman Associates and a former Middle East analyst for the U.S. State Department. And with us from Chicago is author and co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, Ali Abunimah. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ali Abunimah, let me start with you. Let's look at the broad outlines of the plan here. It calls for Israel to annex large parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, full Israeli sovereignty, as we just heard from our reporter, over Jerusalem, and Israel will take overriding security responsibility for the state of Palestine. Here's what the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to say.
It's a great plan for Israel. It's a great plan for peace. If the Palestinians are genuinely prepared to take that path, if they're genuinely prepared to make peace with the Jewish state, and if they agree to abide by all the conditions you have put forward in your plan, Israel will be there. Israel will be prepared to negotiate peace right away.
This is the plan, Ali Abunimah, that President Trump has called the deal of the century. What do you make of it?
Well, it's not surprising to hear Benjamin Netanyahu say everything he said, because wouldn't it be great for Israel if the Palestinians simply surrendered all their rights? And that's exactly what this plan would require of Palestinians. And I think the best description of it came from Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, speaking at the African Union the other day, just before that body condemned the plan. And what President Ramaphosa said is this plan resembles very closely the Bantustans, the so-called black homelands that the racist government of South Africa set up in the 1970s and 80s to try to fool the world into thinking that it was giving black people self-rule and self-determination, when in fact it was simply pushing them into small reservations. It is the fantasy of Israel and its most fanatical supporters that Palestinians would accept the fate of the Bantustans or accept to be put onto reservations like Native Americans were, and that's just not going to happen. Their fantasy of Palestinian surrender and Israeli victory over Palestinian rights is no closer today than it was before Trump announced this so-called plan.
Matthew Brodsky, as we've heard, it's a very controversial plan, and as Ali Abunimah just told us a moment ago, it's the kind of Israeli-American version of South Africa's Bantustan system. So, you have the platform. Make your case for the Trump-Kushner plan.
Well, the plan itself is based on reality, and I suppose it's easy to take out the exact same talking points that were used literally verbatim in 2000 and 2001, which was at this point now 4 peace offer or parameters ago that the United States has been involved in. And the fact is, there's a trend line that we're on here, where the Palestinian Authority refuses to get engaged in the peace process, specifically this time, and they have not decided to, they either reject the peace offers that are made or the negotiating parameters, or they simply don't engage in them. I think it's time for them to come to the table. That's what this is. It's based on reality. It's not based on talking points. It's not based on mythology. And that's a lot of what you unfortunately end up hearing. The case for the peace plan is best because it is for the Palestinian people themselves in addition to the Israeli people. The idea that you can stay in the status quo, which is what the Palestinian Authority apparently is just fine with, doesn't do anything to solve any of these issues. To continue to sell mythology that the Jews will be pushed out of Jerusalem, that millions of refugees will return to Israel itself that are Palestinian while a Palestinian state is created next door, is mythology and fantasy, and frankly, that's what your other guest is promoting and has always promoted.
Graeme, Matthew makes a point
Can I respond to that personal attack?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've never heard of your other guest before, but what I'm promoting is that Palestinians have exactly the same human rights and rights under international law that everyone else has. And it is not Palestinians who are refusing peace or refusing justice. It is Israel that the whole world knows has been occupying Palestinian land for decades, building settlements in violation of international law. And in fact, the International Criminal Court is investigating Israel's settlements in the West Bank as a war crime as we speak. And we had the news that the indicted president of Sudan, former president of Sudan, is about to be handed over to that court. I think Israeli leaders like Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu should be very worried that their day will come when they too are brought before the International Criminal Court for the crime of occupation, the crime of settlement, and the crime of apartheid. And if it's fantasy to say that all people should have human rights, yes, then indeed the Palestinians are fantasists.
Okay, let me move on. Graeme, you've spent a good part. One moment, Matthew. I'll get to you.
Nothing for that.
I'll get to you, Matthew. You've spent a good part of your career as an analyst on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the seemingly intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict from Camp David to the present. No plan has so far been able to deliver peace and security. Do you have any hope that this plan would work?
Oh, I think this plan is actually a step back from making the accomplishment, because we had in place parameters for the negotiations since 1967, 242, 338, which led through the peace with Egypt in 79 and with Jordan in the early 90s. That was based on the borders of 67, and we negotiate. And the hope was that we, the United States, could foster the Palestinians and the Israelis to negotiate an agreement. What this has done is changed the parameters by which you start negotiation from 242 and 338 to almost a settlement that the Israelis want from the beginning. So they've changed the entire negotiating basis for negotiations. It can't possibly work because you're asking the Palestinians to give up everything before they sit down at the table. They have no choice but to reject it. And I think most of the other Arabs in the region who even want to be supportive of us find this step was a little bit too far for them to even get into the process. That's why the Arab League, I think, was so solid against it. Even the countries that have peace with Israel, Jordan and Egypt, could not go along with this, even though they would like to.
Jonathan, the mantra that we've been hearing for the past 60 years, a two-state solution is the only way out of this impasse. Under the current plan, do you see a viable two-state solution happening?
In a word, no. I think the two-state solution is dead and has been dead for quite a while. You know, in diplomacy or in the real world, there's basically two levels of things going on. There's the world of the diplomats, where people dress in nice suits and they negotiate and they sit down and they sign documents on the dotted line. And those are the official documents. Then there's what's happening on the ground. And that's the other level. What's been happening on the ground in the occupied territories is that, as Ali Abunimah said, the Israelis have been building settlements. It is against the Geneva Convention to move the population of a conquering country into conquered land. That is illegal. So the settlements are illegal. As Graeme said, the United States, the Trump administration, has changed the entire basis of negotiation, which was based on international law, United Nations Resolution 242. The Trump administration says that the settlements are not illegal. It says that Jerusalem now belongs to Israel, and that this is not actually the Palestinian issue, but in another area of Middle East dispute, the Golan Heights is now, according to the United States, a valid part of Israel. And in the process of moving settlers into the West Bank, if you combine the Jewish population of East Jerusalem, which is occupied territory, and the West Bank, there's probably something like 700 to 800,000 Jews living in those territories. They're very hard to remove.
Okay. Matthew, let me get your view on that. I mean, we heard two views here from Jonathan and from Graeme. The fact that the parameters of the discussions have changed, the basis for the negotiations have changed, and this plan basically gives Israel what it wants without any negotiations starting.
What we just heard is cartoonish nonsense. The actual resolution 242, the Middle East peace is supposed to be built on, does not say that Israel needs to withdraw from all territories. It simply doesn't say that. In exchange for peace, Israel will withdraw from territories. That's what the resolution says. You can look it up. The whole idea that the basis for negotiations is the June 4, 1967 line is a lie. That's not what the basis is held inside the resolution that they themselves cite. So just look it up. But that's what, they've been discussing for 5 minutes. All of this is fantasy. Deal with the reality, which is there needs to be a Palestinian partner that comes to the table and negotiates. They need to have a position that is actually going to be something that they can get. It can't be based on fantasy and mythology that somehow an international organization is going to deliver Jerusalem, make it free of Jews, and make refugees suddenly decide to come back to Israel to swallow that state. It's not going to happen. If you want to deal with reality, the fact is this provides for a Palestinian state, this current peace plan, and it provides for a capital in East Jerusalem for Palestinians as well. That's the important part. They should come to the table if they have a disagreement and negotiate.
Okay. Ali Abunimah, I'll get to you, Ali Abunimah. Graeme, you want to say something?
I would just like to make a point on, there are a lot of things that we could talk about with what you just said, but let's take the issue of Jerusalem, which I'm more familiar with. On Jerusalem, in the Camp David agreement between the Egyptians and the Israelis, there is a side letter that says the American position on Jerusalem is that the legal status of Jerusalem cannot be changed except through negotiations. And this fundamentally changes that. Secondly, we then signed a series of questions.
It doesn't.
What do you mean nonsense? That's exactly what the American
commitment. It doesn't.
It says that. It's a side letter to Sadat from President Carter. Then there's a series of questions that we answered to King Hussein of Jordan. One of the questions was on Jerusalem, and we said the exact same language in that question to King Hussein. I'm familiar with that because I helped edit those, both the letter and the side letter and the questions.
All right. Let me go to Ali Abunimah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think let's keep our eye on the big picture and on reality, as your other guest keeps insisting. The reality is that there are about 12 million Israeli Jews and Palestinians living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Just over half of the population are Palestinians. Jews are now a small minority. The reality today is a one-state solution. Israel is the sole ruler of every inch of the territory. It decides what comes in and out of Gaza and who comes in and out of Gaza. It controls the West Bank. It controls the borders. It controls the economy. Right now, the Israeli occupier has banned Palestinian farmers in the West Bank from exporting their produce to Jordan, and so on. Israel has total control.
Okay.
And what the Trump plan is, no, I'd like to finish my point.
Go ahead.
What the Trump plan is an attempt to formalize a one-state solution in which, at best, Palestinians have, very limited local autonomy that Israel will try to dress up as a state. What I say, and what many, many more people are saying, is, yes, let's go with the one-state solution, but we do it in a way where everyone has equal rights, Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And what you'll find is that the strong objection to that comes from Israelis and their supporters who insist that Israeli Jews should have special and better rights than Palestinians, just as Israeli law enshrines, and that they should not have equal rights. And I think in the 21st century, we should be talking about equal rights.
Yeah.
Equal rights was the way to deal with civil rights in the United States. equal rights was the way to deal with apartheid in South
That's
Africa.
worked wonderfully
And equal
throughout the
rights is
region.
how we will deal
Yes.
with this as well.
Okay. Hello, Abunimah. Let me ask you this very quickly before I move on. The United States, as part of this plan, is also promising $50 billion over the next 10 years in development assistance. It also allows for future negotiations on settlements. Can this plan not be used then as a basis for negotiations?
No, because the 50 billion is just, you know, is just words on paper. No one knows where it would come from. It would come with so many strings attached, like US aid always does. I doubt Palestinians would see a real penny of it. So this is just headlines. And I mean, the basic point is Palestinian rights aren't for sale. The Jared Kushner effort to get Palestinians to sell their rights would not work. It's just racist to think that Palestinians would sell their country any more than French people would sell their country, or Belgians would sell their country, or Americans would sell their country. Palestine is not for sale, and Palestinians cannot be bribed or bullied into giving up their human
so I've got to move on.
as your other guest wants them to.
Right. Jonathan.
You know, some years back, there was a debate in Israel. And the basic parameters of that debate was that Israel wants three things, and it can only have two of them. The three things that it wants are, it wants to be a Jewish state, it wants to be a democracy, and it wants the West Bank. But if you take the West Bank and keep the West Bank, and you want to be a democracy, then you have to give the Arabs the vote, and you're no longer a Jewish state. If you take the West Bank and you want to be a Jewish state, then you don't give the Arabs a vote, and you're not a democracy.
Right.
So the whole debate was, at a certain point, Israel is going to have to choose which it wants to be, a Jewish state or a democracy. I would argue that Israel has chosen to be a Jewish state. And the plan that the Trump plan that the Israelis embrace, and it's not just the right wing that embraces it, it's also Benny Gantz and the opposition, which is, I guess, the remnant of the left in Israel. He embraces it too. And the fact that that plan is now put forward as the basis and both sides are embracing it confirms that the decision by the Israelis is to be a Jewish state.
Matthew, is that the stark choice that Israel faces, either be a democracy or be a Jewish state?
No, but I mean, you're having a panel discussion where a viewer would tune in, and apparently the Palestinians aren't even actors in any of this. It's just the Israelis do things to Palestinians, and that's it. Palestinians have not done anything. The Arab neighbors have not done anything. We should use, for a free example, of course, the equal rights that are so prevalent throughout the Middle East. I mean, come on.
What does
the
that have to
absurdity
do with
of what's being discussed here is absolutely nuts. The idea that we'll have a one-state solution. So I have a brilliant idea. We'll just, of course, swallow the Jewish state up with the Palestinian state, right?
So you're against equal rights.
Make lefties in America feel wonderful. That's of course ridiculous. You know that's ridiculous.
You're trying to pull the
wool over the eyes of the people who are watching the program and anyone who has sense here. And
why are you against equal rights?
Really? All right. Talking about anything based in reality, or is everyone just going to mumble the same talking points for the past 20 years?
You can filibuster, but I mean, what you remind me of back in the 1980s, and I remember this.
Give me equal time with each one of you, and I'm happy to address it.
Back in the 1980s, when the anti-apartheid movement was saying apartheid has to end, the racist diplomats from South Africa would come on the television and they'd say exactly what you were saying. They'd say, show us anywhere in Africa where there's a democracy. Hold on a second.
You're asking for a Palestinian state free of Jews. That is apartheid. What, are you insane?
I mean, you can't invent what I said.
Israel is. There are equal rights for the Arab citizens.
You should
the
stay
second
calm.
most winning
Calm
party
down.
was the Joint List of Arabs. You're talking insanity here. It's literal lie
why
upon
are you
lie
against?
upon lie.
Okay.
I mean,
the
look.
fact that there should be a Palestinian state free of Jews.
All right, I've got to move on.
Your
Look,
creation,
I mean,
and you're trying to
look,
sell that that's not apartheid.
He just wants
That's
to
what
run
it
down the
is.
clock so nobody can get a point in. But
Very
here's
quickly.
the thing. I mean, listen to the
There's one of
contradiction.
me, three
He's
of you.
saying
Do the
how
math.
fantastic it is. He's saying how fantastic it is that some Palestinians can vote in Israel. Great. So let's have all Palestinians voting. What he wants to have
The
his cake and
citizens
eat
of
it. Just-
Israel can vote.
well, okay, so if
Okay.
everyone is a citizen of the same country,
All right, listen, I have to
everyone,
move on.
Israeli,
I have to move
Jews,
on,
and
gentlemen. One
Palestinians
moment.
can vote.
Graeme, I want to get to you. Something that we haven't talked about here. You know, we talked about the West Bank, we've talked about the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, etc., but we haven't talked about Hamas, which controls Gaza. Can any peace plan move forward without Hamas?
It's simply no. I mean, Hamas represents a large portion of the Palestinian people. I was an election observer at the elections when Hamas won the election. Actually, for the first 3 Palestinian elections, I was an election observer. There was no question that they won. And what we did and the Israelis did is we're not going to recognize them as legitimate. So therefore, we have moved the winners of the election out of the process. That doesn't mean there aren't horrible people in Hamas and they're bad, but you somehow have to get that segment of the Palestinian into the debate or into the discussion, or you can't have peace. It's like you have a range of views in Israel. You have to get all of those views into the process.
Yeah.
You have a range of views among the Palestinians. You have to get them into the process too. So yes, Hamas somehow has to find a role for them in the process.
Jonathan, very quickly, I've got a minute left. This is the cynical view, as we heard from our reporter in Tel Aviv. This peace plan is a bit of a ploy to help both Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump, who both want to satisfy their domestic audiences. One's facing an election, both facing an election, actually.
I would agree with that. I mean, look at the timing. It comes sort of in the middle of the impeachment. It distracts attention from the impeachment. And it also is, I think, a favor, a bone that Trump is throwing to Netanyahu, who is facing not only criminal charges, but he's facing another election on March 2nd. So this helps him. Now, I would argue that no matter who wins, this plan is going to be embraced by both sides because, as we discussed before, Benny Gantz also likes it.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search the Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe.